This is part one of two parts for Chapter 5 of Memory Hierarchy out of Computer Organization Assembly by Dr. Patterson and Henderson. So we've gone over quite a bit, and now we're going to fill in the organization part on how memory and memory mapping works in computers. In this first part, I'm going to kind of explain the background, the why, some principles of memory, and then we're going to talk about a couple of ways we can map memory, and that will be good for part one. So let's talk about memory here. So memory technology, kind of the driving constraint behind some of this organization. So, and we've talked a little bit about this in class, how cache, you have cache, and then RAM, and then your hard drive, whatever it may be, right? So you have different levels of memory. Well, why? Why is that there, right? Well, if you look at the cost, if we could do everything in magnetic disk, right? I mean, it's unrealistic example, but if we had magnetic disk next to cache, right? This would be so dirt cheap, right? And this is 2014, so using Moore's law, by the time you watch this video, if magnetic disk still exists, it'll be really cheap, right? But we don't do that, right? Why don't we do that? Because every time, as you've learned, as we're operating in nanoseconds or less on the cache, on the CPU in stages on the pipeline, well, can you imagine 5 millisecond delay or even a 20 millisecond delay, right? I mean, you'd have to stall thousands and delay with thousands of instructions, maybe even tens of thousands or more, just to stall while you're waiting for memory to come in. And at that point, it's a losing game, right? You're not going to be able to, it's supply and demand. By the time you get what you need to process your next pipe in the CPU, you'd already be behind, needing like 10 more things, right? So then the other option is we just do everything static RAM. So why not have the whole computer in static RAM? Because then we have these incredible access times, right? The fastest here, right, of all of these currently. And again, this is a little outdated, right? And then that way we would have a swimmingly fast computer. Well, the problem is the cost, right? So this is the trade-off, speed and cost. So you can see here, and this is a little bit excessive to say the least. Again, this is going to follow Moore's law here, but it's expensive. We can't do that. And the norm now for computers in 2019 is terabytes. So in terabytes, I mean, imagine the cost, even if this is reduced to $1,000. That's not going to work, right? Even if it's $500. So for mainstream computer development. So instead, we kind of do a bunch, right? We go midfield, and what we do is we create memory hierarchy. And then we say, how can we do that effectively, right? So we have these memory hierarchy levels, right, where you have your hard disk out here, and the disk is divided into blocks, right? May also be known as a line, and they have some, maybe 32, 64 bits, 128, it doesn't matter, 156. It's just considered a block. Whatever data or instruction or information is at that block, okay? Then you have RAM, and then you have cache down at the processor, and this kind of balances out the cost versus time. So ideally, now that we've created this memory hierarchy, we want what's most often accessed next to the processor, right? And what's least often accessed, maybe is never even accessed, stays out in the hard disk, right? So if something is here where we need it, when we need it, it's called a hit. And you can create a hit ratio based on how many times you tried to find something and it was there, versus a miss ratio, how many times you tried to find something and it wasn't here, so you had to go all the way out. Okay, now there's two principles that govern this, okay, called temporal locality and spatial locality. So generally with programs, what's found in behavior is that if you've accessed something at address, I'm going to use really fictitious example here, 12, you're more likely to access something soon at address 11, maybe 10, or 13, 14, but especially 12, than say 64 or another block, okay? it's very likely based on this principle called temporal locality. Okay. Likewise, spatial locality is what I explained first. The temporal locality is now you're likely to access it again and soon. So if you accessed address 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, you're likely to access them again, and you're likely to access them soon, within close time to each other. Well, this is very useful, as it turns out, based on the way we always operate in class, as we've talked about in assembler, right? Incrementing the PC by 4. This is very useful because now we can almost always have the data we need on demand, or the instructions, right, closest to the processor based on these two principles. So this kind of talks about how we take advantage of that, right? As we want to copy what's most useful even into RAM, for example, right? And keep them there, and then pull down into cache more recently accessed, right? As close as possible to the CPU. Okay, going over the technology really briefly, we've talked a lot about static RAM in class. It was covered a lot in Appendix B in the book. Again, it's fast access, not very dense, but it's very expensive to make currently. DRAM is a little cheaper, a little slower, but it's more dense, and as of the time of this, we're at DDR4 at least for data rate for direct random access memory. And then flash memory. Recently, like this computer that I'm presenting on and recording, I have a solid state drive, right, instead of a disk, because it's moved up and improved in its performance. It's more cost viable now, and to make up for some of the speed reductions, there's a DRAM buffer. Now, I haven't looked at this hard drive technology I have specifically in this computer, but what they're doing on some of them is putting a buffer in between to increase the speed performance even a little bit further. Flash memory is EEPROM, right? So this EEPROM, we've talked a lot about PROM in class. So this, I'm not going to go in depth here, but just a trade-off here to be aware of is it wears out based on its construction. So you have to spread out the use of the memory across flash, which kind of interrupts some of the temporal and spatial locality principles, but that's where this guy comes in as a buffer. Okay, and then disk memory going all the way out to the hard drive. Traditionally, platters have been used. They're kind of going out of style now because of, like I said, I can get the same benefit and lower cost for using flash as my solid state drive. But long story short, there's platters. They'll have multiple platters, and they'll have a read and write head maybe on both sides here, depending on the design. You can see this stack of platters. As I don't know how many readers, writers here to actually check. They're very fragile. I mean, if any of you've had them, you've dropped a computer and it don't work no more, you kind of know you probably broke your hard disk. And usually they're sealed on production, so they can't be disturbed after that. Okay, so that's the technology. That's the why, the temporal and spatial locality, and some of the costs and information about them. Okay, now let's talk about cache. Okay, presuming there is a memory hierarchy. Okay, how do we know where the data is, and how do we know where to look for it? There's some good questions, because as I've said, we can't afford to have as much cache in terabytes per se as we can solid state drive, right? So cache is going to be some sample set. The best analogy I can use in the book that I can think of right now, and the book uses this, I like it, is if you're going to study for a test, right, and you go to the library and you find out that the books you're interested in, let's say our computer organization and assembly, you go to the bookshelf after you find out where it is. So this is way out in disk memory, as an analogous example. You find out where it is, and you go to the bookshelf and you find the book you want. Well, while you're there, you see 3 other books that are related right next to it. So that's spatial locality. You just grab them and bring them with you, so that in temporal locality, when you're sitting at your desk, temporal locality and recency, you can kind of think of it at the same time, same thing. You don't have to go from your desk after reading these 3 books back up, or one of them, to get the other one. No, you just keep the 3 there. Maybe you grab 4 or 5 of them, right, to the next student's dismay, because when they come they're all gone. But when you're sitting at your desk studying, now you have all the books you need close to you, and you're going to be accessing them over and over again recently. So how do we do this efficiently in a computer? Well, we do what's called mapping. Okay, and the first one we're going to go over is direct mapping, because it's a good lead-in to some of the other things like associative, fully, or set associative mapping later. So direct mapping is one of the first ways. Direct mapping basically rides on this really simple formula, right? That whatever is in the large, your hard disk, right? We're just going to take samples of it, and we'll create an index and a tag to map them. Okay. So for example, there's 32 blocks here. Again, hard drive, right, referenced as blocks of memory. These may be 32, 64, 128, 28 bits. Doesn't matter. The point is they're referenced as blocks. So this is block 0, this is block 31. 32 blocks. Okay? This is a highly simplistic example just to kind of get us familiar. Alright? And then we go down to cache. Okay? Going down to cache, we have only 8 blocks available. So obviously we can't write everything into cache. So what we do is, to simplify our referencing scheme, is we do this formula right here. We take the block address, the main memory, and we do modulus of it by the number of blocks in cache. So for example, 32 blocks of memory, right? 8 blocks in cache. So let's do one of these. That's what all these arrows represent. So let's go out to this address, right? So this is 00101, or 5, but it's actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The 6th address, because we're nerds and we always start at 0. So even though this is 5, it's the 6th address, right? So block address 6, right? And we're going to mod it by 8. Well, obviously 8 doesn't go into 6. The remainder is 6. So the new block address in cache is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right there, right? And here's the reference we're going to leave with it. We're going to just take these last 3 values here. This is nice because it's power of 8, so it's a simple, or power of 2, so it's a simple example. So we take these last 3 bits, right? Put a tag there, okay? Alright, but check this out. Let's go a little further. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. 14 mod 8. Oh, bummer, it's 6 also. So it also maps to this address. So that's why we've got to have this little tag here, because either one of these, well, which one? Sorry, I shouldn't say that. Because 101 and 101 is the same. So we need the tag of what's left in front, because which one of these addresses is actually stored in cache block 6. So let's talk about that. So we solved one problem and created another. So how do we know which particular block is stored in a cache location? Well, we need to do a couple things. First, let's talk about a valid bit. When cache is initialized, we need to know what is actually has valid information in it, right? And then what memory address does it reference back out to in main memory. So the first part is easy. Valid bit either says yes, there's valid information here, or no, it's not. Okay, so that's the valid bit. So it's just a 1 or 0, right? The other part, which I was referencing and misspoke there for a second, is the tag, right? And all we need is the higher order bits. I apologize, I said these up first. So all we need is these higher order bits to determine what address is actually there, because by definition, if this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the 6th position, right, in our cache, then we know it's indexed, referenced out to these positions in main memory. We just need to know which one. So we just need the first 2 bits of each of these to determine based on the number of blocks in memory and the number of blocks in cache. So that's where the tag comes from, that's where the valid bit comes from. For example, alright, if we have 8 blocks, one word is 1 block, and it's direct map, here's the initial state of our cache. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, all the valid bits are set to no. the tags are all empty and there's no data at any of them. Again, could be information, could be data, could be an instruction, could be data. There's just nothing there right now, okay? It's initialized. So the first seek that we do is looking for decimal word address 22. Let's just focus on these so we're not going back and forth, right? Which is 10110, okay? And it's a miss. So we've got to go all the way out, main memory. We go all, extend memory, go all the way out there. We pull it into cache, okay? Here's our index, right? Here's our valid bit is now yes, this is actually useful cache, right? Here's our tag. We only take these leading 2 bits, right? Here's the information, whatever may be there, okay? And it's called a miss. So that takes a while. All right, let's do another one. Okay, now we want the word at address 26, block 26. Well, it's not in cache, right? We look, it's not there a second ago, right? It wasn't there, it was empty, right? So we go grab that also. So we set this to a valid bit, we bring in the data, okay? Now, the next slide's a little confusing because it replays, but based on the law of recency, we want to re-access both these addresses suddenly right away, okay? Well, this time, we've already pulled 22 in and 26 in, so when we go to find that information, we look at this address, the index, and check the tag. They're valid, sorry. Then check the tag, and bam, we have 2 hits, 22 and 26. They're there. So the law of recency was just temporal locality was just fulfilled. Okay. But now we request 16, 3, and 16. Okay. So 16, the first time we try to access it, turns as binary, right? 1 0 0 0 0, or 0 as the block for the cache. There's nothing there, so we fill it, we make it valid, we put the tag, and we move it in. Okay. Now we request what's at 3, which converts to this index 011. So we fill it, we put the tag and the memory, right? Because there was nothing there. Guess what? Law of temporal locality is fulfilled again. We hit 16 and we check everything. We check the valid, the tag, and it's there. So we don't have to go out. So we save ourselves a lot of time. Now we look for word at address 18, which here's the index 010. Well, there's already something at 010 that belongs to this guy, 26, right? The tag's 11, right? But something else just mapped to it also, so we're going to overwrite it. So when we go there and we go to this address, we check the tag. I can remember a second ago it was 11, right? Tag didn't match, so now it's a miss and we have to overwrite it. Okay. So that's kind of the cache game with direct mapping, highly simplified. Okay. Here's what it looks like, kind of almost at a semi-quasi logic circuit level. So you can see valid bit, the tag, and then the data, and you can see this says 32 bits, okay, 0 to 31, okay. All right, let's do some more math for an example. If we have, in this case, a larger block size and more memory, so let's say you have a block address of 1200. Here's your entry parameters. 64 blocks, 16 bytes a block. Here's the question. What block number does address 1200 map to? So out in your main memory, right, block 1200, obviously you've got a lot of memory there, okay? So you take 1200 divided by 16, right? And that's going to give you, we haven't seen this yet, okay? This is, I'm showing you now. That's going to give you equal to your block number in cache, right? And then we're going to use module, right, to reduce that down further, like I showed you here, right, to find its index. Okay, so when we reduce that down further, right, then we get down to 11. Okay, so now you found the block number of where it goes in cache. So 1200 divided by 16 bytes per block, to divide that up, 75, and then you take 75 module 64 blocks in cache, and now you have your index for cache. Alright, here's some considerations. Larger blocks should reduce miss rate due to spatial locality, but doesn't always work that way, right? There's more competition, so you have increased miss rate. And the word they use here, synonymous word, is pollution. In other words, you know, when you have larger blocks in your cache, you're constantly overwriting what's there, and so you may miss what you actually needed. Even with spatial locality, you might miss what you needed. Okay, here's some trade-offs to give you an example of finding the sweet spot, right, of block size versus memory size. Alright, and I introduced this a little bit already, that what a cache miss equates to. Let's get more in depth on this. So let's get much more information on this going now. So if we are, you know, cruising along, processing instructions in the pipeline, and we're constantly getting hits, right, then this presumes that nanosecond or less delay in accessing cache. But if we get a miss, now we have to fetch the block from the next level of hierarchy, so it costs a lot more. So there's a penalty for that. So if we miss it, which like early in the program when we're initially, it's miss, loading everything in, right? It may have been an instruction it was fetching or data. Either way, it treats them fairly similar. The book does a good job talking about this. Let me see if I can pull that up real quick from the book. Well, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Hold on one sec. Let me finish this and then we'll get to it. There's two ways to deal with it. So let's talk through. Right? Let's talk about, let me see if there's rights yet. No, this is a good place to talk about it. So let's pull up the book on what we do when there's cache miss. Right here. So page 416 in your book. Here's what we do when there's a cache miss, right? And it's roughly the same for data and instructions, right? We've got to go back 4, right? Because in the pipeline we already went ahead 4 for the next instruction in memory, right? Then we need to do a read and wait for it to access. Then we need to write that into cache, right? And then restart the instruction, but now using cache. So if you think about it, it's almost like because we did a miss, we have to add more than one instruction or work to be done through the pipeline. So there's definitely a price to pay, and I want to talk through this for you to think about what the cost is when we have a miss from cache. Okay, so that's a miss on reads. Okay, when we're trying to read information. Now let's talk about writes. Okay, so presuming we have what we need in cache, we're using it, and now we perform some instructions like an add I or something, and we update the value in cache. Okay, so if we update the value in cache, but we never update the value outside of cache, essentially the program doesn't live beyond that immediate use, right, which is undesirable. We need to be able to load it in its state that we closed it in, so it's got to be written back out at some point. Right, and so now we play a game with writes, just like we did with reads. Now we're playing a game with writes. So on a data write hit, we could just update the block in cache, but then, like I said, cache and memory would be inconsistent. So what we can do is write through, where we also update memory. Well, writing all the way out again to main memory or your hard drive is going to be very expensive, right? And the example it gives here is your effective CPI because of this, right? If it takes 100 times or 100 units, let's say 100 cycles, okay, to go write this out in your main memory, right? And 1 cycle to write it, update your cache, and then 100 in main memory, right? Even with 10% instruction stores, right? You know, you're still looking at 11 CPU cycles effectively to write this out as your effective CPI. So it's not effective, is the point, okay? So one solution to this problem is a write buffer, and we can talk through some examples in class. But one solution is a write buffer, right? It holds data waiting to be written to memory, and so the CPU just continues with what it's doing, cache is updated, and then it gives to the write buffer, go write this out to main memory. And it only stalls now if the write buffer is full. On the other side, another way you could do it is if you have data that's in your cache and it's there already, when you write it, right, you write the information, you just update cache, okay? And then you only replace what's called a dirty block, or something that's inconsistent, right, between your cache and your main memory when you need to overwrite your cache. For example, you've done a the program's running, just like I gave the examples earlier. It's a miss the first time, it reads it way out from memory, pulls it into cache. And then the next instruction, it needs to update that value in cache it just pulled with a new value, okay? And it updates it. And then in the next instruction, it needs to read from main memory something that indexes to the same address of that block of cache you just updated. Well, we can't just overwrite it now because we never wrote it back out to main memory. So we need to now overwrite main memory with that value in cache, and then we can replace the cache value with our new index. This is again part of the price we pay with we have a smaller sample set of cache than we do in our main hard drive. So we've got this small sample set in cache, and so we've got only so many indexes. It's kind of like when you guys were getting comfortable with, hey, I only have 32 or 8 or 16, however many registers in my assembly language, right? I need to decide what to keep there and what to get rid of, right? It's the same thing with cache. So what about on a write miss, right? This is the case where we need to write the instruction, we perform the instruction, it's an add or a subtract or something, and we go to write it into cache, and the index and tag don't line up, so we didn't even have the value there yet. Well, there's a couple ways to deal with that, right? We do it if it's on a miss, or don't do it on a write around. So there's a couple ways to deal with this. Maybe we can talk about this more later. Okay, here, courtesy of Dr. Glock in the book, it gives an example of an embedded MIPS processor, right, on Intrinsity FastMATH, and it just gives you some digital logic here on what it looks like and how it accessed it. Again, we may talk about this more later. I want to keep moving and talk about, well, yeah, we'll talk about this more later. I want to talk about another way to access cache, since we're on the subject. So that was direct map caching that we went over. So if you need to pause or go back or read the book to get your mind on that, go ahead before we go forward with this, because now this kind of muddies the water a little further, right? So associative caches is a case where instead of direct mapping and just doing a module, we have the cache divided into like areas or regions, or sets is what they're called. Okay, so fully associative, instead of having an index related to its memory address, we could have a hard drive address, main memory, written to any value in cache, right? Well, now that means we can't just use our reference indexing scheme real quick to find cache value and see if it's a hit or a miss. Now we have to search every cache block to see if the address we're looking for is there. So it requires a comparator, right, to compare. And oh, by the way, we want to search every one of them all at the same time. So again, we're not stalling the pipeline. Otherwise, we're basically just creating DRAM next to our cache or flash next to our cache. So generally, instead, on the one end, the book does a good job talking about this. You have direct mapped, and on the other end, you have fully associative. Direct mapped, where it's always locked in to its index by reference. Fully associative, it could be anywhere in cache. And so there's kind of a middle ground where you create what's called set associative, where you divide up cache into blocks, and then those blocks are assigned into a set. Okay, and then you decide where something is saved in those sets, again based on the block number modded by the number of sets in the cache instead of the number of blocks in the cache. and then you search all those entries in a given set at once. Well, now in parallel, we're only searching, some in number of sets instead of all of them, so it's less expensive. Let's look at a picture. Picture is easier. So here's direct mapped, right? The block at 4 here, and here's the tag. Okay. Here's set associative. So there's 4 sets in these 8 blocks. Okay, so that means each set gets 2 blocks. So you can see right here, here's the 2 blocks that belong to set 0, 2 blocks that belong to set 1, 2 blocks 2, etc. Here's fully associative, where there's no direct mapping at all between the data and the data in cache and main memory. There's no direct mapping, and so the tag here has nothing to do with its relative position in memory. It's just that's where we decided to write that information in cache. Alright, here's another way of picturing it. Here's one-way set, or one set associative, so it's basically just direct mapped. Right at block 0 you have one set, block 1 you have one set, and so forth. Here's two-way, so at block 0 you have 2 possible locations that can be written to in cache at block 1, 2, etc. 4-way, so at each block you have 4, and 8-way, so at 0 example here you'd have 8 separate blocks you could write to. Oops. Alright, so let's give some examples, okay? So just like I did a second ago, accessing the different blocks based on memory request, here's the order of what's requested, the sequence, okay? Alright, so this is already, some modding's already been done, okay? So let's do, this one's a little confusing because it's direct mapped and we already did that, so I'm just going to jump right into a two-way set associative, okay? And this is a little different than what I showed you a second ago, so we're just going to go down the list this way, okay? So this is at any instance in time on this side. So initially, right, we try to access what maps from memory 0, and it's a miss. So it maps to set 0, and we put it in the first location in set 0. Okay. Then we try to access block address 8. We do the math. The cache index is 0. We look in set 0 because these can both be accessed in parallel, and we find out it's not there. Memory 0, the tag for whatever this is there, but for memory 8 the tag is not there. So we need to load it in, so it's a miss. Now again, recency here, so temporal locality, we're trying to access block address 0 again. It maps to set 0. Guess what? It's still there, right, in memory 0, so it's a hit. Okay. Now we try to access 6. What's in block 6? Block 6, the cache index is to set 0. Well, bummer. Set 0 is already full. You can see back at this instance of time up here on this row in the last request, the first part of set 0 is loaded with mem0, the second part of set 0 is loaded with mem8. So when we want to pull this in, we have to blow something away. So we blow away mem8, for example. Well, that's really a bugger because a lot of temporal locality, we try to access 8 again, and it's not there, and we blew it away. So now we've got to bring it in again, and it's a miss. So what if we did fully associative, right? Where we just, anytime anything's requested, we just put it in our cache, right? So this is almost like first in, last out right here as we just load up this cache, right? After each access. So in the first access to block 0, there's no mapping, so we just throw it into cache, say, hey, this is what it is. So we put the whole memory address for it. It's a miss. Block 8, we move it, put it in the next address, and then block 0, it's a hit because we had saved it there. Block 6, it's not there, so we put it in. Block 8, it was already there, so we found it. Now, this example stops here, right? This kind of almost makes it look like, well, why not just do everything fully associative, right? Well, depending on your program size and your cache size, right, this may fill up very quickly and it may not be sufficient. So there's, again, a trade-off, right? So does how many numbers of sets, fully associative, what's the most efficient. This talks about it right here, that there's diminishing returns when we start getting into larger set association. So with a one-way set, right, this is the parameters of the test that was done, okay, a little outdated but still useful. How efficient, what was our miss rate, right? And it decreases, but you can see there's decreasing gains here also, right? And these aren't as a ratio, these are percentages, so they took the ratio times 100, right? So when we go one way, here's our miss. When we go two way, it decreases substantially relative to these other two. But as we go down here, it goes from whole percent decreases to tenths of percents decreases. And there's the extra hardware price to pay for now. Each of those sets have to be searched in parallel. Here's the picture that I've been wanting to get to. So this is what it looks like if you have set associative cache, right? So instead of just this first one and it's directly indexed, right, you have them all running next to each other, and the logic is built in parallel. So truly, when you search a index, you can see the logic here, they're all ANDed and then ORed, right, to find out if it's a hit, and then the data is brought down at the same time. So if it's a hit, right, it'll tell us, and then we'll immediately have the data available too based on the logic. So you get the benefit of it's the same speed essentially of direct map, but you also get the benefit of with direct mapping, you don't have to blow away what's there every time. We have maybe 4 spaces in this case of memory that was mapped to the same index, right? But it's different information or data or instructions. We'll talk about, so how do we decide which one to replace? Let's talk about this real quick. When we replace it, there's a couple different ways. Direct map's kind of easy solution. Direct map, you don't have a choice. When something index references to the same cache address, you just blow away what's there. When you have set associative, there's a couple options, right? You can see if one of them isn't valid. So in other words, if one of these hasn't even been used yet, the valid bit's not set, then use that one, right? The other option is least recently used. So which one is least used? But now that's going to require more logic, right? And then giving roughly the same performance as least recently used is random, right? Just randomly blow one away, replace one that's not there. Okay, this we'll talk about multi-level caches in the next presentation. Let's go back now and fill in some of the math right here. So now that you know how different mappings for caches and performances of technology, right, we can turn all of this into equations, right? We can objectify it a little by the bit, right? So we can create some formulas for memory stall cycles, right, based on memory access, the program, the miss rate, and the miss penalty, right? So we can find out what the cost is going to be, how many cycles we're going to have to stall due to memory when we have a miss. Again, this is worst case, right? So this is not a hit, a miss, okay? So we've talked about all of this, right? What's the miss penalty? What's the miss rate, right? And then memory access and program. And then here's another way of dividing it further, right? Instructions in the program, the misses per instruction times the miss penalty, all right? Here they did some calculations, so you can get an example of plugging these all in, so you can check this if you want to see if these equations work, okay? And then how about average access time? So not just focusing on our worst case scenario of miss, right, but focusing on average, so both the misses and the hits. Well, the average memory access time is the result of the hit time plus the miss rate times the miss penalty, right? And this I think is a pretty transparent formula. How much time does it take when we have a hit plus how much time, that's why we do this multiplication, when we have a miss, right? Percent of miss and miss penalty. Right, these miss rates are important, and the miss ratio here is included because it's not, we don't know what percent of the time. We can't know with definity if it's going to be a miss or hit. We have to calculate some ratio, right, to you know, make a guess, an educated guess. So here's an example below that, and you can try that out, check the math, and see if it works. Here's a good summary on performance, and probably a good place to wrap up this first presentation. When CPU performance increases, the miss penalty becomes more significant. So, in other words, this is a cool thing to think about, but like many of the other things we've talked about with the CPU, is as your CPU gets faster, or your effective CPI is better and better, right? Suddenly your cache performance has to follow suit, right? Because if your cache performance doesn't follow suit, if it doesn't get increasingly better with your CPU performance, when you have a miss, your penalty becomes significant, because now it's gonna, you know, by magnitudes, it tens to hundreds of instructions may have to be stalled, even though you've improved your CPU, your cache hasn't. So you end up, there's a number of trade-offs. So decreasing base CPI, greater proportion of time spent on memory stalls. So I mean, this literally just goes through the trade-offs in performance. So from different angles, right? CPU performance, decreasing CPI, and increasing clock rate. And so bottom line, can't neglect cache behavior when evaluating system performance. These are just kind of three different ways to look at it. Okay. All right, that concludes the first portion. We talked about a whole bunch of things. We talked about, I introduced mapping between cache and main memory hard drives, and I also talked about different samples of that, from direct mapping to fully associative, or an in-between set associative. We talked about what a hit is, what a miss is, and once we knew how to optimize our cache indexing, then how we can calculate those based on the performance. And we talked about the overall trade-offs and designs of these two major mappings that I talked about. And next time we'll talk about a whole bunch of other cool stuff.